Welcome to regulatory requirement for medical devices including in vitro diagnostics in India, version 2, lecture 6, that is clinical investigation of the medical devices and regulation of investigational medical devices. Learning objective, we will aware what is the clinical investigation of the medical devices, what is the difference between clinical investigation of the medical devices and the clinical trial of the drugs, expected outcome. We will able to understand the requirement of the clinical investigation of the medical devices, the standards and the regulatory guidance for conducting the clinical investigation of the medical devices, target audience, the personnel working in the medical devices and in vitro diagnostic industry, innovators of the medical device industry and in vitro diagnostic industry, regulatory affair personnels, human ethics committee members, clinical trial team members, researchers, academicians, students and the person generally interested in the medical device and in vitro diagnostics. What will be learned in this lecture? We will discuss what is the clinical investigation, what are the regulatory requirement for clinical investigation of the medical devices, the standards for clinical investigations, applicable standards and guidance, the types of the clinical investigation in study of the medical devices and the comparison of the medical devices clinical investigation with the clinical trial of the drugs. Include all these chapters. Now first come to the comparison with the drugs. In the previous lectures, we have discussed what is the difference between the drugs and the devices. Also we have discussed the requirement of the clinical trial of the drugs as well as the requirement of the clinical investigation of the drugs. So, in case of the medical devices, the clinical trial is not applicable. The clinical trial is applicable actually for the drugs, wherein the different phases of the trials is required to be carried out to establish the safety and efficacy of the drugs. However, in the medical devices, the pilot study and the pivotal study that is required to be carried out to establish the safety and performance of the medical devices. So, what are the difference? If you see the difference and compare the medical device with the drugs in respect of the trials, you will see the drug trials, the healthy subjects recruitment is there for conducting the trial on the drugs. Initially in the phase 1 trial, the drugs are to be used on the healthy patients. However, the medical devices, it is not possible to insert the medical devices on the healthy subjects. If we see the subjects needed for establishing the safety and efficacy of the drugs, it has to be carried out in the larger population to prove the safety and efficacy of the drugs. However, in the devices, this can be established, the safety and performance can be established by conducting the study on around 100 patient. In the drug cases, In that study, clinical trial study, generally placebo are are to be used. However, for the medical devices it is unethical and it is not possible to use the placebo. If you see the design, the drug trial, randomization and blinding you can do. However, in the device trial it is very difficult. The standard follow up tools to determine the efficacy of the drugs, various instruments like ECG machine, BP apparatus and other equipments to determine the biochemical parameters of the patient. However, for the medical devices, imaging could be an option for the functional assessment. Therefore, the clinical trial, that is phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 trial, that is not applicable for the study of the medical devices. In the drugs trials, the phase 1 trials, phase 2 and phase 3 trial is to be carried out first initially to establish the safety and efficacy. Generally, phase 1 trial is to be carried out in the small number of patients. Then phase 2 to establish the safety and tolerance, and after establishing the safety and tolerance of the dose, in the phase 3, that is the confirmatory study for establishing the safety and efficacy of the drugs. However, for the medical devices, the feasibility study, that is the pilot study, which is to be carried out on the small number of patient, and after establishing the safety in the small patient, the pilot, based on the pilot study data, the pivotal study is required to be carried out to prove the safety and performance of the devices for its intended use. As already discussed, the pharmaceutical clinical trial phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 trials are generally carried out. Phase 1 is carried out on the healthy volunteers and it determines the pharmacokinetics and it safety and efficacy is to be established. Phase 2 and phase 3, phase 2 may be carried out on the patient, small sample size, and phase 3 also need to be carried out on the patient with the large sample size and to establish the safety, tolerance and efficacy of the drugs and pharmaceuticals. And for the medical devices, as already we have discussed, the clinical investigation is required, where there is no concept of the phase 1, phase 2 or phase 3 trials, only the concept of the feasible study and the pivotal study. And the requirement of the clinical investigation of the medical devices, we have discussed that devices have been classified into different class based on the criticality and the intended use of the devices. Class A is the low risk devices, class B low to moderate risk devices, class C moderate to high risk devices, and class D is the high risk devices. So, for the clinical investigation, if the risk of the devices is minimal, then there is no requirement of the clinical investigation. If there is a intermediate risk associated with the medical devices, then clinical investigation may required or may not be required. And for the high risk medical devices, the clinical investigation is required to establish the safety and performance of the devices, and this clinical investigation is applicable only for the devices which falls under the definition of investigational medical devices. For the devices other than the investigational devices, this clinical investigation is not required to be, it is not mandatory to carried out on the devices for which the safety and performance as well as the efficacy has already been established. So, for high risk devices and the intermediate risk devices, there is a requirement of the clinical investigation, and the low risk devices like class A devices, there is no requirement of the clinical investigation. If we see the global scenario of the clinical requirement of the clinical trial or the clinical investigation of the medical devices, the in USA, the regulation of the medical devices is under the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. In Europe, that is the Medical Device Directive. The pre-market and post-market supervision is required by the FDA, US FDA. The Center for Device and Radiological Health is accountable for pre-market and post-market supervision of the devices available in the market. In Europe, the notified body, they are the authority for grant of the CE certification. The risk classification as per the US FDA, the medical devices have been classified into 3-tier system, class 1, class 2 and class 3, where the class 1 devices is the low risk. There is no requirement of the clinical trial or the clinical investigation. Class 2 and class 3, where the intermediate risk or the high risk, there is a requirement of the clinical investigation. In Europe, the devices have been classified into 4 different categories: class 1, class 1A, class 2, in Europe, the medical devices have been classified based on the risk. Class 1, that is the low risk devices, class 2A, that is the low to moderate risk devices, class 2B, that is the moderate to high risk devices, and class 4, that is in Europe, the devices have been classified into 4 categories: class 1 devices, that is the low risk devices, class 2A, that is the low to moderate risk, class 2B, that is the moderate to high risk, and class 3 devices, that is the high risk devices. Approval system for class A in USA, it is under general control. Class 2, that pre-market notification process. Class 3, that is the special control, pre-market approval is required. In Europe, the manufacturer need to establish the CE, to exhibit the CE marking in order to ensure that the device is safe, fit for its intended use. If you see the regulatory requirement for the clinical investigation of the medical devices in Japan, Australia and Canada, the Japan, the PMDA is the responsible, is the authority to monitor the safety and efficacy of the medical devices in their country. In Australia, it is a Therapeutic Goods Administration, and in Canada, Health Canada, the Therapeutic Product Division, which is responsible for monitoring or supervision of the medical devices marketing in their country. They have classified the medical devices based on the risk. In Japan, the medical devices have been classified into class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, wherein class is the low risk devices and class 4 is the high risk devices require special control. And in Australia, also the classification system is in the line of the European system, where the class 1, class 2A, class 2B, class 3, class 1 is the low risk, class 3 is the high risk. Canada, the classification scheme is Again, class 1, class 2, class 3 and class 4 devices, where the class 1 is the low risk devices and class 4 is the high risk devices. And the low risk devices, as already discussed, there is no requirement of the clinical investigation. If we see the requirement of the clinical investigation as per the medical device rule 2017, in the medical device rule 2017, the specific provision for clinical investigation and clinical performance of the medical devices and the in vitro diagnostic kits have been made. The specific provision have been made in the medical device rule 2017. Certain definitions related to clinical investigation has been defined in the medical device rules. The definitions which have been defined is investigational medical devices, the devices which does not have its predicate devices, or the devices which is claimed for the new intended use or new population or the new material or the major design changes and is being assessed to establish the safety and performance as well as the effectiveness of the clinical investigation. Such devices is defined as the investigational medical devices. Predicate devices definition has been defined in the medical device rule 2017. Predicate device means the devices first time and first of its kind approved for manufacture, for sale or for import by the Central Licensing Authority and has similar intended use, material of construction, design characteristic as the device which is proposed for license in the country. Clinical evidence means in relation to in vitro diagnostic kits, the clinical evidence is the information derived from the specimen collected from the human that support the scientific validity and performance of its intended use. In case of the medical devices, the clinical evidence means the data, the clinical data and the clinical evaluation report that support the scientific validity and performance for its intended use. Clinical investigation is also defined, that is the systematic study on the investigational medical devices in which human participants to assess its safety and performance and effectiveness. Clinical investigation means this systematic study of an investigational medical devices in or on the human participants to assess its safety, performance and effectiveness. Clinical investigation plan means the document which contain the information about the rationale, aim and objective designs and performance management, adverse events, withdrawal and statistical consideration and the record keeping pertaining to the clinical investigation. Clinical performance evaluation, which defines the systematic performance study of the new in vitro diagnostics on the specimen collected from the human participants to assess its performance. Clinical research organization, it means an entity to whom a sponsor may transfer or delegate one or more of its function and duties regarding conduct of the clinical investigation or clinical performance of the evaluation of the in vitro diagnostics. All those definition has been defined in the medical device rule 2017. Now, as we have already discussed, for the establishing the safety and performance of the medical devices, the pilot study is required to be carried out in a small number of population, a small number of the patient to establish the safety of the devices. Normally this studies to be performed approximate 10 to 13 patients in small sites, 3 to 4 sites. The objective of the pilot study includes the assessing feasibility, exploring eligibility criteria and their practical applications for pivotal control investigation. The objective of this study is ascertaining the potential harm, studying device mechanism, validating a method of determination and outcome measures, and also provide the guidance for the pivotal study. Now come to the pivotal clinical investigation. The pivotal clinical investigation shall be carried out on the basis of the data emerging from the pilot clinical investigation study. The pivotal clinical investigation is the definitive, it is a confirmatory study in which evidence is gathered to support the safety and performance or effectiveness of the medical devices for its intended use. This is the confirmatory study that may conducted in large number of patients with the disease or the conditions being studied and scope to provide the effectiveness and adverse effect. For investigational medical devices which does not have a predicate devices but have been approved for sale and distribution of any country other than India, pivotal study need to be carried out primarily to generate the evidence of the safety and effectiveness of the medical devices in the Indian population. Prior to conduct of the pivotal clinical investigation in Indian subject, the Central Licensing Authority, that is the DCGI, Drug Controller General India, may require the pilot study data to assess whether the pilot study data is in conformity to the data already generated outside of the country. The data is used for supporting marketing authorization applications. The fees for various activities related to the clinical investigation. If the clinical investigation is need to be carried out on the investigational medical devices. For pilot study, rupees 1 lakh is there. For pivotal study, 1 lakh is there. For obtaining the import and manufacturing permissions for the devices which does not have predicate devices, 50,000 fees is there. Import license, that is $100, and for the investigational devices import by the government hospitals, 500 Indian currency is required. Import of the investigational medical devices. The investigational medical devices may be imported for the purpose of clinical investigations, and the application in Form 16 along with the documents for which the studies to be carried out, they need to be submitted by the applicant. The Central Licensing Authority will grant the import license for conducting the clinical investigation of the investigational medical devices in MD 17. The import of the investigational medical devices by the government hospitals for the treatment of their patient. The small quantity can be imported by the hospitals, and the application in MD 18 along with the fees, requisite fees and the details of the patient and disease conditions that has to be submitted to the licensing authority, and the licensing authority shall grant the import license in MD 19 after satisfying the requisite information. The import of the investigational medical devices by the government hospitals, medical institution for the treatment of the patient. The application in MD 20 along with the requisite fees and the document required to be submitted, and the permission will be issued in MD21 by the Central Licensing Authority. Grant of permission to conduct the clinical investigation of the investigational medical devices. The application has to be submitted to the Central Licensing Authority in MD22 along with the design analysis data, biocompatibility and animal performance study data, investigator brochure, clinical investigation plan, case report forms, serious adverse event reported, the informed consent form, investigators undertaking, ethics committee approvals, regulatory status in other countries, and the proposed instruction for use and direction for use and label. In case of the medical devices of which drugs are also a part, the submission of the requirement relating to animal toxicology study, reproduction study, teragenicity, perinatal studies, mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, all those data also required to be submitted along with the published data to the Central Licensing Authority. And after satisfying the permission for conduct of the clinical investigation in MD23 shall be issued by the Central Licensing Authority. If the data is not satisfied, the application can be rejected for the reason to be recorded in writing. The conditions of the permissions: the permission is issued by the Central Licensing Authority to the applicant, to the sponsors with the conditions. The conditions of the permission, that is, the investigation shall be carried out after approval of the ethics committee, which is registered with the Central Licensing Authority. Another condition, that is the study, the clinical investigation study shall be carried out in accordance with the clinical investigation plan and good clinical practices guidelines issued by the Central Licensing Authority, that is the CDSCO. Another condition, it shall be registered with the Clinical Trial Registry of India before enrolling the first patient of such clinical investigation. Another condition is the annual status report of each investigation, each clinical investigation, as to whether it is ongoing, completed or terminated, shall be submitted to the Central Licensing Authority by the sponsor. In case of termination of any clinical investigation, the detailed reason for the same shall be communicated to the Central Licensing Authority within a period of 30 days. The information about any unexpected serious adverse event occurring during the clinical investigation within 14 days, that details has to be submitted to the Central Licensing Authority. In case of injury, death during the investigation, the use of the investigation medical devices, the applicant or the sponsor shall provide the complete medical management and compensation. The premises of the sponsors, including the employees, subsidiaries and the branches, their agent, their contractors, subcontractors, and the clinical investigation sites shall be open for inspection by the officers of the Central Licensing Authority to verify the compliance of the requirement of the medical device rules for conduct of the clinical investigation. The clinical investigation shall be carried out by enrolling first patient within a period of 1 year from the date of grant of the permission, failing which prior permission is again required to be obtained by the applicant from the Central Licensing Authority. The sponsor holding the permission shall maintain the data, record, registries, and other document for the period of 7 years after completion of the such investigation. These are the conditions of the clinical investigation permissions obtained from the Central Licensing Authority. There is also certain cases waiver of the clinical trial of the investigational medical devices. No permission for conduct of the clinical investigation for academic purpose is required from the Central Licensing Authority. However, such investigation shall be approved by the ethics committee approved for such study. The data generated during the study of the academic study shall not be used for the purpose of commercialization of their product. The clinical investigation is also not required to be carried out in case if the Central Licensing Authority may see that if it is in the public interest, the data, animal data or the clinical data for conducting the clinical investigation, if it is the indicated for life threatening or the serious disease or the disease of the special relevance to the Indian population or the national emergency, or in case of extreme emergency, epidemic or the medical devices indicated for the conditions, disease for which there is no therapy. In such cases, the licensing authority may consider the application for waiver of the clinical investigation of the investigation medical devices. The result of the clinical investigation may not be required to be submitted where the investigational medical devices is approved by the regulatory authority, either by the UK or USA or Australia or the Canada or Japan, and the said devices has been marketed in those country at least for 2 years, and the Central Licensing Authority is satisfied with the data of the safety, performance and pharmacovigilance of the devices, and there is no evidence of the theoretical possibility on the basis of existing knowledge or any other difference in the behavior and the performance of the Indian populations. The applicant need to give an undertaking in writing to conduct the post-market clinical investigation with the objective of the safety and the performance of such investigational medical devices as per protocol approved by the Central Licensing Authority. So, in such cases, the requirement of the clinical investigation may be waived off. The post-market clinical investigation. The post-marketing clinical investigation is the study other than the surveillance performed after the marketing approval has been given to the medical devices in relation to approved indication. This study may not be considered necessary at the time of medical device approval, but may be required by the Central Licensing Authority for optimizing the intended use of the medical devices. The post-market clinical investigation include additional drug device interaction, safety studies, investigation designed to support use under the approved indications, the subsequent of the approval of the investigational medical devices. The applicant shall submit periodic safety updated report once the products are marketed into the country. The PSR shall be submitted every 6 months initially for the 2 years, and another 2 years annually they need to submit the PSUR. The permission to import or the manufacture medical devices which does not have predicate devices, we have discussed in the previous lecture. For this, the applicant has to submit the application to the Central Licensing Authority in MD 26 the requisite fees and the data as mentioned in the 4th schedule of the Medical Device Rule 2017 has to be submitted to the Central Licensing Authority along with the clinical data, biocompatibility, biological evaluation data, validation data, stability data and other chemical data as mentioned in the 4th schedule of the Medical Device Rule 2017. After satisfying the requirement, the Central Licensing Authority shall give the permission in Form 27 to the applicant. Also, there is certain conditions in the permission given by the Central Licensing Authority for the devices which does not have the predicate devices. They have to submit the periodic safety updated report every 6 months for initially 2 years and annually for another 2 years. The medical devices shall confirm the specifications submitted along with the applications. The permission holder shall inform the date of launch of the devices in the market to the Central Licensing Authority. They shall submit the suspected unexpected serious adverse event within the 15 days of the awareness of the event of such incidents to the Central Licensing Authority. The guidelines for the conducting clinical investigation has already been prescribed in the 7th schedule of Medical Device Rule 2017, which is in the line of ISO 14155 2011, that is the clinical investigation of the medical devices for human subjects, good clinical practices. Now, let us have look on the structure of the ISO 14155 2011. These guidelines have 9 components. One is scope, part 2 that is the normative reference which is based on the ISO 14971 risk management process. The standards includes terms and definitions, part 4 the ethical considerations, clinical investigation planning, clinical investigation conduct, suspension, termination and close out of the clinical investigations, responsibility of the sponsors, responsibility of the principal investigators. All those details and guidelines have been prescribed in these standards, and the same guidelines, the 7th schedule of the Medical Device Rule 2017 have the similar guidelines for conduct of the clinical trial, clinical investigation. The guidelines and standards available globally with respect to the clinical investigation of the medical devices or the clinical trial of the medical devices. In USA, the ICH and GCP guidelines, and also they recognize the ISO 14155. In European Union, there is a directive, Medical Device Directive 2005-28 EC GCP guidelines, and the Medical Device Directive guidelines 2001-20, as well as the ISO 14155. In Japan, the Japan Medical Device GCP guidelines, which is also in the line of ISO 14155 2011. The Health Canada GCP under the Canadian Medical Device Regulations, Australia GCP as per CP MPICH 135/95. These are the guidelines and standards related to clinical trial of the medical devices or the clinical investigation of the medical devices. Now, let us have some question answer session. Now, again please read this statement whether it is true or false. The pilot study and the pivotal studies are the types of the trials in the medical devices. It is true or false? It is true. It is applicable for the medical devices. The permission to conduct the clinical investigation for an investigational medical devices will be granted in form MD22. Is it true? No, it is not it true. It is a application. The permission is granted in MD23. Now, can you fill up this statement, complete this statement? The standards and guidelines for the clinical investigation which have been prescribed in the ISO. Which ISO standards it is prescribed? Yeah, it is ISO 14155 2011. Thank you.